What happens when the boy they tried to destroy becomes the voice the whole nation listens to? The courtroom was silent when the door creaked open, and Jamal Turner walked in handcuffed, his eyes filled with confusion and fear. The whispers spread like wildfire, a black teenager accused of theft and assault against a wealthy white man. But was it true, or just another lie dressed as justice? Edward Briggs, the powerful lawyer, smirked as he adjusted his tie, whispering to the detective beside him, "I'll crush him before the first witness stands." Judge Caroline Hayes watched with a sharp gaze, unaware that the boy standing before her was not just any defendant, but someone with blood tied to the very heart of justice. Jamal stood quietly, his mind replaying the events that led him here: the false accusation, the planted evidence, the cruel laughter of the men who dragged him to the station. Every glance in the courtroom screamed judgment, every sigh carried doubt. Yet in his silence, there was something unbroken, something waiting to rise. The prosecutor began his speech, throwing words like knives, calling Jamal a thug, a liar, a danger to society. The crowd nodded, as if truth came only in suits and money. Jamal's attorney sat nervously, knowing the case was fixed from the start. But Edward Briggs didn't know one thing: Jamal's mother had made a call last night. And the person who answered wasn't an ordinary man. He was the Attorney General of the United Kingdom, and Jamal was his only son. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with tension as reporters gathered outside, flashing cameras at every move of Edward Briggs, the man who loved attention more than truth. Inside, the air was thick with judgment and whispered hatred as Jamal Turner sat at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly under the weight of the world. The boy looked fragile, but his eyes told a story of quiet strength, of someone raised to fight battles others could never see. Judge Caroline Hayes entered her courtroom, her heels echoing like thunder across the marble floor as everyone rose. Edward gave a smug smile, thinking he had already won. Beside him, Detective Ron Miller sat, smirking, confident that his lies would hold. Jamal's lawyer, a young public defender, looked nervous, clutching his file like a shield, knowing the odds were stacked against them. Edward began with his usual performance, packing across the floor like a predator circling his prey. He painted Jamal as a violent troublemaker who had attacked a store owner for no reason, who had stolen a watch worth thousands. His voice was calm, cold, cruel. Every sentence was carefully crafted to break Jamal down. The spectators nodded, some whispering things that burned through the boy's chest like knives. But Jamal said nothing. He kept his eyes on the floor, hearing every cruel word, but remembering what his mother told him, that truth doesn't shout, it waits. When Edward called Detective Ron Miller to the stand, the courtroom leaned forward. The detective raised his hand and lied through his teeth, claiming he saw Jamal running from the crime scene, claiming the store's security footage showed his face, even though that footage had been edited by Edward himself. Jamal's lawyer tried to object, but Edward was too skilled, too powerful, twisting every word, every fact, until lies sounded like evidence. The judge frowned slightly, sensing something wasn't right, but she couldn't prove it yet. Then came the break no one expected. Grace from the store, a timid cashier, stepped into the courtroom, trembling but determined. She had been silent for days, afraid to lose her job, afraid of Edward's threats. But her conscience couldn't take it anymore. She raised her hand and said, "I saw what happened. Jamal didn't steal anything. It was Detective Miller who handed Edward the watch before the arrest." The room fell silent. Edward's face turned pale. The crowd gasped. Judge Caroline leaned forward, her tone sharp. "Miss, are you sure of what you're saying?" Grace nodded, tears in her eyes. She explained how Edward had told her to stay quiet, how the footage was changed, how Jamal was framed from the start. The courtroom exploded in chaos as Edward tried to shout over her voice, but the judge slammed her gavel, demanding order. Jamal sat frozen, staring at the woman who just risked everything for the truth. For the first time since his arrest, he felt hope flicker inside his chest. The judge ordered the footage to be re-examined and called for the Attorney General's office to verify the evidence. That was when the atmosphere changed completely. The clerk whispered something to the judge, handing her a sealed note from the Attorney General himself. Caroline opened it, and her face went white. The letter revealed everything. Jamal Turner was not just another teenager. He was the only son of the Attorney General of the United Kingdom, the nation's highest legal authority. The boy everyone mocked, the one the lawyer framed, the one society condemned for his color, was the heir of the very system Edward had manipulated. The room went still, like time itself had stopped. Edward's arrogance crumbled, his breath shallow, his hands shaking as realization hit him like thunder. Jamal lifted his eyes, calm, strong, and steady, staring right into Edward's. Judge Caroline turned to the courtroom, her voice firm and cold. This trial is over. All charges against Jamal Turner are dropped immediately. Detective Miller, you are under arrest for evidence tampering. Mr. Briggs, you will face disciplinary review for perjury, obstruction, and racial misconduct. The gavel struck one final time, echoing like judgment itself. As Edward was dragged out of the courtroom, shouting his last pathetic defense, Jamal's mother entered quietly, tears in her eyes. The spectators who once whispered hate now stood in stunned silence as the truth unfolded before them. The young man they had judged for his skin had stood taller than everyone in the room. Jamal looked at his mother, then at the judge, and smiled faintly. The boy who was framed had become the voice of justice, and as he walked out of the courtroom, his head high, the cameras flashed again, but this time, the story they captured was different. The crowd wasn't looking at a suspect anymore, they were looking at strength, at dignity, at truth. Comment justice if you believe truth always wins. Subscribe for more powerful, real-life justice stories. The courtroom that had once been filled with whispers of judgment now sat in heavy silence. Every spectator's eyes were fixed on Jamal Turner, the black teenager they once believed guilty, now revealed as the son of the Attorney General himself. The same people who had sneered at him, who had whispered cruel words about his skin and his background, now sat frozen in disbelief. But Jamal didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He just sat there, hands folded calmly, eyes steady, the weight of a world's prejudice pressing on his shoulders. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every young black boy ever framed, doubted, or silenced. Judge Caroline Hayes took a long breath as she looked at the courtroom. Her voice, firm yet emotional, broke the silence. I have seen many cases in my years on this bench, she said, but this one cuts deeper than any. The system meant to protect justice was twisted to destroy it. Her gaze shifted to Edward Briggs, who now sat hunched at the prosecution table, pale and sweating. Gone was the arrogance. Gone was the smirk. His mask of superiority had shattered, revealing the fear of a man whose sins had finally caught up to him. Edward tried to speak, but his voice cracked. Your Honor, enough, the judge snapped. You framed a child. You used the law as a weapon against the innocent. You lied under oath. You disgraced this court and everything it stands for. Her gavel struck the desk once, the sound echoing like thunder. Meanwhile, Detective Ron Miller's face had gone gray. He tried to slip quietly out the back, but officers were already there, waiting for him. The same badge he once flashed with pride now felt like a curse pinned to his chest. As they cuffed him, he looked back at Jamal. Kid, he muttered, his voice shaking. I was just doing my job. Jamal looked at him, eyes calm but filled with something deeper, pity. No, he said softly, you were doing Edward's job. Edward stood now, desperate, hands trembling as he turned to the judge. It was just a misunderstanding. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know. The judge's voice sliced through the air. You didn't need to know who he was, Mr. Briggs. You only needed to know that he was a boy, a human being. But you saw his color, and that was all that mattered to you. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Edward's legs weakened. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built on deceit and arrogance was collapsing before his eyes. The Attorney General himself walked into the courtroom at that very moment, his presence commanding, his face unreadable. The man who had built the nation's justice system now stared at the lawyer who had tried to destroy his son's life. I trusted this system, the Attorney General said, his deep voice echoing. But today I see that the system itself is sick, with pride, with hatred, with men like you poisoning it. He turned to Jamal and placed a hand on his shoulder. Son, I am proud of you. You fought the battle that even the law failed to fight. Tears glistened in Jamal's eyes, but he didn't cry. Not here, not in front of the same people who doubted him. He simply nodded. The judge declared a recess, but no one moved. Everyone sat still, absorbing the weight of what they had witnessed. Reporters outside scrambled to capture every detail. The news had spread like wildfire. Black teen framed by racist lawyer turns out to be Attorney General's son. The headlines burned across every screen in London. Protests began outside the courthouse, voices shouting for justice, equality, and change. Inside, Edward sat motionless. His world had ended. The smug lawyer who once sneered at others was now nothing but a symbol of disgrace. He looked up, seeing Jamal walk past him with quiet dignity, and whispered, I didn't mean for it to go this far. Stopped, turned slightly and said, it always goes this far when people like you stay blind. Outside the courthouse, a crowd waited for Jamal. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, but he said only one sentence that silenced everyone. This was never about revenge, he said. It was about truth. Caroline watched from the window, her eyes misty. She knew the world had changed a little that day, but she also knew it still had a long way to go. She had seen justice served, but not the end of racism, not yet. She hoped Jamal's story would open eyes that had stayed shut for too long. That night, Edward Briggs was charged with perjury, evidence tampering, and racial misconduct. Detective Miller faced the same. Grace, the brave cashier, was offered witness protection. And Jamal, once called a criminal, was offered an internship by the Attorney General's office. The very same system that tried to destroy him now needed his strength to rebuild it. As the chapter closed, Jamal sat by his father's grave, the night wind cold but calm. "Dad," he whispered, "I didn't just clear my name, I cleared something bigger." He placed a small flower on the stone, his heart steady. Justice, it finally spoke. The story of Jamal Turner wasn't just another courtroom tale. It was a mirror, a reflection of the world's prejudice and the power of truth to break it. Comment truth if you believe no lie can hide forever. Subscribe for more stories that prove justice still lives. The morning after the courtroom erupted with truth, London was a different city. Headlines screamed across every newspaper, televisions played the same footage on repeat, and the people's voices grew louder with every passing hour. The story of a young black teenager, framed by a racist lawyer who turned out to be the Attorney General's son, had shaken the nation's faith in its own justice system. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of protesters gathered with signs that read "Justice for Jamal, end racial framing, and truth has no color." The cold wind carried their chants through the streets like a storm of reckoning. Inside, however, silence reigned once again. The final verdict was about to be read, and everyone knew this day would define the rest of their lives. Judge Caroline Hayes sat behind the bench, her expression grave yet resolute. Her eyes scanned the courtroom from Edward Briggs sitting in defeat, to Detective Ron Miller handcuffed and surrounded by officers, to Jamal Turner seated beside the Attorney General, his back straight, his eyes calm. He was no longer the frightened boy who once stood trembling before the court. He was something else now, a symbol, a reminder that truth could rise even from the ashes of hate. Edward Briggs' lawyer made a desperate plea for leniency, but every word fell flat. The evidence was overwhelming: false testimonies, planted evidence, secret payments, and emails proving Edward's manipulation of Detective Miller. The judge's voice echoed through the room as she spoke. "Edward Briggs, you used your privilege and your power not to serve the law, but to serve your prejudice. You corrupted the very system that trusted you. You will serve 20 years in federal prison, with no chance of early release." The courtroom gasped. Edward's face turned pale as marble. He turned toward Jamal, eyes wide, searching for mercy. But Jamal did not flinch. He simply met his gaze and said quietly, "You sentenced yourself the moment you framed me." Detective Ron Miller tried to speak next, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I only followed orders." "No," Judge Hayes interrupted sharply. "You followed corruption, and now you'll follow it to prison, 15 years. The gavel came down again. Hard and final. The courtroom erupted into whispers, then cheers. Reporters scrambled outside, cameras flashing as the world learned that justice had finally been served. The Attorney General stood, placing a firm hand on Jamal's shoulder, his pride and pain intertwined. "You've done more than clear your name, son," he said softly. "You've shown the nation what real justice looks like." Outside, the crowd erupted in applause when Jamal stepped through the courthouse doors. Microphones extended, reporters shouted questions, but he simply raised his hand to quiet them. His voice carried power beyond his years. "What happened to me isn't just my story," he said. "It's the story of every person judged before being heard. The system doesn't need new laws, it needs new hearts." His words rippled through the crowd, and silence fell for a moment before a chant rose, "Justice for all, justice for all." Meanwhile, in the prison transport van, Edward Briggs sat staring at his cuffed hands. His arrogance had evaporated. He thought about the speeches he'd given about integrity, the awards he'd received for excellence in law, and the lives he'd destroyed to keep his status. The reflection in the small window showed not a man of power, but a man consumed by hate. Tears rolled down his face, but not from guilt, from regret that he'd lost everything he once used to dominate others. In the days that followed, Jamal's story spread far beyond the city. Schools discussed it in classrooms, lawyers debated it in conferences, and young people across the country shared his words online. He became an icon of hope, not because of his bloodline, but because of his resilience. Universities reached out to offer him scholarships. Civil rights organizations requested him as a speaker, but Jamal stayed humble. He visited the same community where he grew up, mentoring kids who reminded him of himself. "Don't let anyone define your worth," he told them. "You define it yourself." Caroline Hayes received letters of praise for her courage and integrity, but she knew the truth. She almost let prejudice blind her too. Every time she passed Jamal's case file, she remembered the moment she almost dismissed him without listening. It haunted her, but also taught her the most valuable lesson of her career. Justice is not blind. It just needs the courage to see clearly. Detective Ron Miller sat in prison, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. Every night, the faces of those he wronged appeared in his mind. He finally understood what Jamal meant. He wasn't just caught in corruption. He was trapped in a system that had long forgotten empathy. For the first time in years, he wrote a letter not to ask for forgiveness, but to confess everything he'd done. The Attorney General received it and quietly filed it as evidence for reform. Months later, Jamal stood on a stage at a national youth conference. The hall was packed, the crowd silent as he began to speak. "I was once called guilty before I spoke a single word," he said. "I was silenced before I could defend myself." But the truth doesn't die just because someone buries it, it waits. It waits for courage to dig it up. The room erupted in applause, but Jamal didn't bask in it. He looked upward, thinking of his late father. "Dad," he whispered in his heart, "your dream of justice didn't end, it began with me." The lights dimmed, the audience rose to their feet, clapping for a boy who had turned pain into power. Outside the hall, protest signs had been replaced by banners that read "Truth lives here." The story that began with a racist lawyer's scheme ended with a nation's awakening. And in that awakening, Jamal realized something powerful. Real justice wasn't a verdict. It was a movement that began the day he refused to stay silent. If you believe truth can outlive lies, comment justice below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories where courage defeats prejudice every single time.